let's jump in. Let's talk about Crimea with this absolutely amazing panel. The two of them are joining us tonight in person. To my right is Professor Rory Finnan. He is the Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge. And he is the reason why we have Ukrainian studies at Cambridge in the first place, because he founded the program in 2008, if I'm not mistaken. I will just mention his latest book, which is Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity and the Poetics of Solidarity, which was published in 2022. And it has already won an array of prizes in Ukrainian studies, in European studies, in nationalism studies, and so on. And all of them are very well deserved. And I will just mention that it is probably the only academic book which has made me tear up because of how brilliant and absolutely beautiful it is. So please, after this event, if you haven't already, go and buy it and read it yourselves. And to my left is Emine Ziedinova. Like Rory, actually, she has recently contributed to the issue of the London Ukrainian Review on Crimean Tatars and Crimea. And she's a fantastic documentary photographer. She is a writer, a researcher, who is originally from Crimea, but was born in Uzbekistan because of the deportation of Crimean Tatars and her family in particular. She explored on all this in an essay which is based on the testimonies of her family, and I encourage you to read this absolutely fantastic work, which throws the light much needed on the atrocity, as Rory names it, committed under Stalin in Crimea and to the Crimean Tatar people. Emine in 2012, between 2012 and 2017, was very busy with documentary photography and journalism in Ukraine. Since then, in 2017, she relocated to London and has worked in the non-profit sector. Currently, she is the co-founder and director of Ukrainian Archive, the organization you all must Google now because it documents Russia's war against Ukraine, very much needed, again, work for which we are all grateful. And joining us online today is Elmira Muratova, whom I hope we have already brought. Yes. Fantastic.
Recording in progress.
Very good. We need this record for history. Elmira Muratova is a postdoctoral researcher at the European Center for Minority Issues in Germany currently. Previously, she worked in the Aarhus Institute of Advanced Studies in Denmark and the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Taurida National University in Ukraine. She has been research fellow in the University of Kansas, UCL, Humboldt University, Charles University, and she's the author of more than 60 chapters and articles on Crimean Tatar identity and religion, and is a fantastic scholar, again, whose work I encourage you to explore. Also with us tonight online is Alim Aliyev, who is the Deputy Director General of the Ukrainian Institute, which is based in Kyiv, not the one organizing this event tonight. He is a human rights defender, curator of educational and of cultural projects, a writer, a journalist. He is on supervisory board of a number of very important Ukrainian NGOs. He is also the initiator of a very important book project called Crimean Fig, Krymsky Injir, which again brings Crimean Tatar voices to Ukrainian readership. He is also the co-author of the book on Mustafa Djemilev, the leader of the Crimean Tatar people, with the subtitle Unbreakable, And basically Alim is one of those people who never sleep, as I can imagine. So please join me in another round of applause for the privilege to have such speakers with us tonight. I will go back to the occasion which brought us here, which is the 80 years since the deportation of the Crimean Tatars from their homeland, which happened in 1944. And I would like to address my first question to you, Emine. Obviously a very broad question, but I would like you to tell us what this deportation actually meant for the Crimean Tatar people, and perhaps you could explain this very complex and tragic history through the example of your own family.
Thank you for the question and introduction. I think it's my family is quite common, like oops. I think the story of my family is quite common for Crimean Tatars, and I think almost every Crimean Tatar family has very similar story. Like, I would say maybe what the difference is that because I studied sociology and I did some oral history course while I was doing my course at university, I actually was interested and I was able to record interviews with my grandmother, and that led to the deeper interest in the issue, which led to the multiple interviews with my grandmother through the time, which the last one I recorded in 2017, and I recorded interviews very in-depth biographical interviews with my mom. But the story is very common. The family lived in Crimea peacefully, and there was a war, and in 18th of May, pretty much entire family was deported forcefully from Crimea to Uzbekistan. If you're talking, of course not everyone survived, and my great-grandmother on my mom's side, she died right after deportation, which meant that one of my grandmother ended up in orphanage. But looking back into history, actually being in orphanage at the time, maybe it wasn't, even though the conditions were horrendous, it was not as bad as being deported to the collective farms, for example, because there were no work, no food, and there is the level of death was much higher than in the state institution, which was itself really bad. And I think when I've been recording these interviews with my grandmother and with my mom previously, especially before 2014, I always thought, this is the past, but it's interesting from the perspective of the history. But I kind of didn't link it as much to today. But I think after 2014, and especially since I'm doing some research on the family history, I look at these events and they feel so familiar and they're so contemporary. And so I just want to give several examples and maybe read a couple quotes. So I looked back through the transcript with my grandmother, and I asked her a question: what was her first memory of Crimea? And she told me the story that she remembers the first time she was 5 years old, and her house in the village of Eski-Burnak was searched by NKVD. It's 1937, and her father was taken away that night. And we are talking about the period of Stalin purges and persecution of the times of dvoikas and troikas executing a lot of people in Ukraine and all over former Soviet Union. But what I'm trying to say, when you read that, when I read this story right now, it's it feels like today, because since 2014, almost every Crimean Tatar neighborhood or settlement around Simferopol and Bakhchisarai and other places, they were constantly have searches from FSB. And we see exactly like really similar stories when the kids are at home and they come early in the morning, and just as my grandmother memory. And maybe I mean, of course the times are different, and what struck me from that is that actually her family didn't know what happened to her father, and they hoped that he would come back. And when she learned about the story, it was after Soviet Union collapse, when she returned to Crimea in 1990, and she went to archives. And throughout her childhood, her mother would always put away the jar of jam or like of sugar in case if her husband or her son would come from Red Army, and they didn't know what happened to them. And this story, like if you look at Ukraine today, it's also like so familiar. We have occupied territories right now. It's not only Crimea, Donbass, Kherson, Kharkov, not as much Kharkov anymore, but we have like very similar story, missing people, like families like split, and people don't like also like cannot find their loved ones. And then deportation itself, I was covering in 2014 the annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation, and I've been working as a journalist with TV crew at the time. And I just remember this scene when I come back home on the day of off. It was March 8th or March 9th, and my mom is all upset, and she's packing her documents in this backpack, and she's like convinced that they're going to be deported. And I think this collective trauma, which like passed through the generation, it's pretty much you have a crisis situation again, you have annexation, and you know that you're unfavorable minority that like could happen again to you. And also, I think that theme of deportation is not only trauma within our own community when we feel threatened and persecuted, but it's also like, I'll tell the story about one of the people who live on my street in the village actually. And one of the questions was like, it's my aunt, he's her neighbor, and he was like, March 2014, he was like asking her, oh, if you would be deported, could I actually take over your house? And that is like a real story, and these people we lived, and I grew up with these people on the same street. And so, and I think like what this, for me today, is looking back at this history of 1937, of 1944, our life in Uzbekistan, in deportation places, and coming back to like homecoming in Crimea, and how Soviet Union pretty much discriminated and persecuted Crimean Tatars, and all these war crimes, which was like no one was taken accountable for it. It just like, it feels to me right now, this like, if we didn't manage to address it at that time, and now we have history repeating in different shape, in different form, but it's like, it's pretty much the roots are from there. That's what the history of my family today means to me.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I mean, I'm sure like you have tons of questions, but I still would like to give each of our speakers a chance to say a few words before we delve into this discussion. But this is absolutely like priceless observations, because I think that all of us here are convinced that it is the impunity that today is the root of evil that is unfolding in Ukraine because of Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea. My next question is for Elmira, who I hope can hear me well. I think we need to explore the Crimean Tatar identity and to actually pay attention to religious specificity of the indigenous people of Crimea. And there is basically no better person to address this question than Elmira, who has written extensively on the subject. I'm particularly curious. Crimean Tatars are Sunni Muslim minority in Ukraine, and I would like us to explore how Islam and how their religion actually shaped their memory of the deportation, and how their religion is today shaping the perception of Crimean Tatars, and perhaps their resistance and their ongoing struggle. So please, Elmira, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Actually, you raised so many questions which deserve to be separate lectures, topics of several lectures. So I tried to be very brief. I hope you can hear me well. So I think that it makes sense to talk about the role of Islam in the memory of deportation by distinguishing between different periods. For example, during the Soviet period, when Crimean Tatars were in exile and the political regime was extremely repressive, the role of Islam could be seen in the collective prayers, which Crimean Tatars call dua, that Crimean Tatars organized to commemorate their relatives who died as a result of forced displacement. And almost all families at that time had such close or distant relatives. And those religious gatherings, they were also a place where Crimean Tatars shared information about the deportation, which was very important because of the absence of other places, public places where to do it. And it was places where they talked about how it happened and how it affected their families. What is also important is that dua in Soviet time also served as occasion to pass on this knowledge to younger generations of Crimean Tatars born in exile. For example, it's how this information was passed to my parents and to my generation in Uzbekistan. If we look at the post-Soviet period, we can see that after repatriation of Crimean Tatars to Crimea, which at that time was already part of independent Ukraine, there were more favorable conditions for commemorating the deportation, because deportation was recognized as a crime by Ukrainian state, and this created a political and moral framework for the development of various forms of memory politics. And we witness it in post-Soviet Crimea, like numerous and very diverse events and initiatives to commemorate the deportation, in which Islam played very important role. For example, there was institutional cooperation between the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people, the representative body, and the Muftiyat, a centralized religious institution of Crimean Tatars established in Crimea in the early 1990s. And the Muftiyat was the organizer and also active participant in many commemorative events dedicated to the deportation. For example, there was annual moving rally in the Crimean capital Simferopol, where Mufti always addressed people with prayer and also speech, together with the leaders of the Mejlis. And besides, Muftiyat every year on May 18 organized special khutbas, sermons at mosques dedicated to the victims of the deportation. So there was a long-lasting tradition of organizing such khutbas and prayers. What is interesting is that we can find these religious Islamic topics not only in the activity of religious organizations at that time, but also in various aesthetic forms of commemoration. For example, in poetry, in paintings, in cinema. And I want to mention the feature film Haydarma by Crimean Tatar director Ahtem Sitablayev, where there is a scene where an elderly woman takes with her into exile only the Quran and says that this holy book contains everything a person needs in this life. If you haven't seen that film, that movie, I recommend you because it's very enlightening. And actually, it captures this common narrative of Crimean Tatars, how the deportation happened, because it's based on true stories of survivors of the deportation. So this scene, like others, reflects the grand narrative of Crimean Tatars about the deportation and highlights this very important role of Islam in Crimean Tatars' mindset. Now let's look at post-2014 Crimea and the annexed Crimea. And we can see that memory politics of the deportation is highly regulated by Russian state. It corresponds to Russian narratives about the Soviet past and especially about the so-called Great Patriotic War. And for example, if we look at the monument to the victims of deportation built by Russians at Sürgünlik station in Bokshitarai, this is the place where in May 1944, the Crimean Tatars were collected and put into wagons for forced relocation. So we can see victims, the Crimean Tatars, boarding the train, but we will not see the perpetrators, the Soviet special and military forces responsible for the deportation. So we see this is narrative, how Russian authorities want to present the deportation. So it was a tragedy, it happened in the past, so let's leave it in the past. Let's not point to the perpetrators. Let's not talk about those who are guilty in the tragedy. So what is interesting that Crimean Muftiat, the same I mentioned before, which chose a collaborative coping strategy in post-2014 Crimea, attended the unveiling and thus legitimized the monument and the narrative around it. Muftiat also can still organize some khutbah sermons in mosques, but do it in a way that does not exacerbate anti-Russian sentiments among Crimean Tatars. So there is still some space for memory politics of deportation, but it's very highly regulated by state approved. It goes in within state approved forms. And if we look, for example, at religious groups that are persecuted in nowadays Crimea, and we can see there that how they engage in various grassroots initiatives of memory of deportation, and how they use the memory of deportation as a tool to mobilize Crimean Tatars against repression, against the Russian occupation. And for example, there is such an organization called Crimean Solidarity, which nowadays is a platform that unites various like Crimean Tatars with various backgrounds who are like joined because they do not like how Russia behaves and develops its policy towards the Crimean Tatars. So members of this organization widely use the metaphor of hybrid deportation. And by hybrid deportation, they mean forcing Crimean Tatars to leave Crimea and also like send them to Russian penal colonies outside of Crimea. So to sum up, it is possible to say that Islam played and still plays a very important role in the memory politics of the deportation, but this role depends on and shaped by security and also political context in which this memory develops.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Elmira. I think it was as comprehensive an answer as we could get under such time restrictions that we've got tonight. And from concentrating specifically on the Crimean Tatar people, I would like us to move to the relationship that these people has formed with Ukrainians. And Rory, this is a small and trivial question for you. Could you please give us a potted history of the relationship between Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians they have enjoyed for centuries, and how this relationship changed since 2014 and since the occupation of Crimea?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Sasha. It's always a pleasure to sit beside you. And I want to thank the organizers, Elmaz, Ilona, Lesio Khrumaychuk, director of the Ukrainian Institute, all of our friends here. And to mention how much of a privilege it is to be speaking with Emine, Elmira, and Alim, from whom I've learned so much. I think I want to follow on from what Elmira just mentioned, because I do think in this discussion, and I know I speak for everyone here, we are alive to the present of what's taking place in occupied Ukraine, how deportations and recolonization is taking place in occupied parts of Ukraine, in Crimea. Elmira just mentioned the hybrid deportations that have been taking place since 2014, thousands of Crimean Tatars leaving for mainland Ukraine, particularly after 2014. But since the advent of the full-scale invasion in 2022, there have been many more thousands who have been forced to leave to places like Turkey, Western Europe, etc. And also to talk a little bit about indigeneity, because we've mentioned indigenous the indigenous status of the Crimean Tatars, and it's worth pointing out how in international law this is a very complex and contested issue, but its applicability to the Crimean Tatars is apt and very clear. So the abiding and very central international document is the ILO's document, the Convention on Indigenous Tribes and Peoples of 1989. And the definition of indigeneity and indigenous peoples is very flexible in this convention. This has been something of a difficult issue for both international law and domestic law. But essentially it pivots on this idea of a relationship, a connection between a particular territory, land, and a people who, first of all, self-perceive as indigenous, who have a long-standing relationship to that territory, to that land, before there's a moment of conquest and colonization. So this connection between the land and people is very, very central to the concept of indigeneity, and it's something, of course, that the Crimean Tatars have celebrated in their culture and have written so much about in their culture. And it's important for us to understand it. And one way to illustrate this relationship is to look at something quite different, and that is to remember the very insecure, very defensive meme that circulated particularly in 2014. The meme was Krym nash, Crimea is ours. It was a meme circulated by many Russian audiences, even politicians, in the wake of the annexation operation. It frames Crimea as an object. It frames Crimea as an object of control, of possession. This is not the way Crimea has been described, thought about, prayed over in the Crimean Tatar imagination. So the watchwords for the Crimean Tatars is not Crimea is ours, it's Crimea is us. That Crimea, this place, is an essential element, a synthetic element to their national identity, to their sense of self. And that's precisely why, for centuries, the Crimean Tatars have been a target of the Kremlin's projects of marginalization, neutralization, and eradication. It's very important for us to understand just how long this has gone on. It begins in the 18th and 19th centuries and continues through the 20th. And that's exactly why, for instance, this relationship has been a source of insecurity for the Kremlin. It's why, for instance, someone like Putin repeatedly has to say that Crimea is iskona ruskaya zemlya, that it's perennial Russian land, because deep down he understands, and most Russians understand, that that's not true. They understand that the Crimean Tatars have a special, inextricable relationship to the peninsula, and not only. We can talk maybe a little bit later about the connection between the peninsula and the southern steppelands of Ukraine, which are very, very key historically. But it gives the lie to this presentation of Crimea as Russian. Unfortunately, this is something that a lot of Western scholars, Western politicians have entertained for a very long time, and right now we're trying to, of course, deconstruct these myths. One of the ways we can do so is by studying the history of a Crimean Tatar Crimea, and that's important that we do this, and we do it in the frame of Ukrainian studies as well. And this was once a really vibrant field. In the 1920s, 1930s, there were many Ukrainian scholars who studied very closely Crimean Tatar literature and culture and history, Hat Angel Krimsky being the famous example, but not the only one. And to your question, Sasha, about the history, this relationship between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, it is a very, very complicated story. It's a very complicated story. It's not been a bed of roses, this relationship over centuries. But I want to talk to you about the mainstream, the trajectory of this relationship that's evolved over centuries, because it is a very moving story. It's an important story for us to understand here in Britain and in Western Europe, where we have frequent and very casual discussions about Islam, Islamic fundamentalism, etc. But the story between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars shows us something different. It shows us right now a Sunni Muslim nation that is actively shaping a Ukrainian civic identity and has been doing so for a very long time. So those of you who have studied Ukrainian history, and many students are probably amid exams, and for those of you who are suffering through them, good luck. But it's important to remember that the emergence of a Ukrainian political project begins thanks to, in part, an alliance with the Crimean Tatar Khanate in the 17th century. Were it not for that alliance with the Khan, Bogdan Khmelnytsky and his Cossack forces likely would have not prevailed over Poland. We wouldn't have seen the emergence of the Hetmanate. And what we have over centuries is a connection between the Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians as overlapping stateless peoples who lose vestiges of their sovereignty at the end of the 18th century. And the coincidence of timing is important for us to understand because it speaks to this symbiotic political relationship. It's a symbiotic political relationship that, frankly, a lot of Russian disinformation, conventional historiography has sought to obscure. And we need to return to it and to see how this symbiosis can be revived and celebrated today. In the Soviet period, Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians were both subjected to genocidal violence, both with the Sürgün, the deportation event that Emine so evocatively described earlier through her personal story, but also, of course, Holodomor of 1932-33. This has led to, as we see in 1991, the emergence of an independent Ukraine. And the democratic forces that participated in that movement, in that moment of independence, were very invested in the Crimean Tatar national movement, and the Crimean Tatar national movement was very invested in the Ukrainian one. And were it not for that connection once again, we likely wouldn't have seen such a vibrant emergence of a liberal democratic set of parties, including Ruch, in the 1980s. So that relationship was very decisive. However, so that's a positive story, okay? But the positive story also has to confront stories of mutual antagonism, of stereotypes, of this Russian strategy of divide and conquer. We can't ignore those things because in Ukrainian cultural memory, there are indeed stories of Crimean Tatar slave raids from the 16th and 17th centuries. And conversely, in Crimean Tatar cultural memory, there are stories of Ukrainians participating in and benefiting from Crimean Tatar dispossession over centuries. These leave really deep scars. And so it's important for us in an academic sphere to unpack these memories and these historical events and to understand what they mean for us today. So just to sum up this very complicated story, Sasha, I want to end on a positive note, but one that also critiques the Ukrainian state for taking too long to acknowledge the indigenous status of the Crimean Tatar people. It took 3 decades for this to get done, and there are a lot of reasons why. One thing that's important to understand is that there were local political forces on the peninsula of Crimea that were not always aligned very well with Kyiv. But from 1991, there were efforts to legally recognize and unpack the idea of being indigenous, not only for the Crimean Tatars, but also for the Karayim and the Krimchak peoples. So there are 3 peoples recognized under Ukrainian law as indigenous. In 1996, when Ukraine composed its constitution, there was reference to indigenous peoples, but there wasn't really a description of which ones and really what their protection under law meant. But after 2014, unfortunately too little too late, the Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament, recognized that the Crimean Tatars had rights in the Ukrainian state. 2015, they recognized the deportation as genocide. And then very quickly, under Zelensky's leadership actually, and we should give him a lot of credit for this, in 2021, finally this law on indigenous peoples was written. It offers Crimean Tatars and indeed the Karayim and Krimchak different laws and protections for their language, for their national culture, ensuring representation in government. So finally, after 3 decades, the Ukrainian state has installed this notion of an indigenous Crimean Tatar people in law. And that's something to celebrate, obviously, with that context and the proviso that it took too long to get there. And it took a geopolitical catastrophe with the the annexation of 2014. That triggered it, and that was, again, a little too late. So I'll leave it there and hope that we can continue the conversation in Q&A.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you for not shying away from pointing out the mistakes made by the Ukrainian state, and we are paying a very high cost for these mistakes, and it's very important for us to recognize and rectify whatever is possible to rectify at this point. And this brings me to my question for Alim Aliyev, who is incredibly active in the diplomatic sphere, but also within the Crimean Tatar community inside Ukraine. I would like Alim to try and tell us how the resistance of Crimean Tatars looks these days inside Crimea. It would be useful to try and understand how many of them are currently repressed by the occupation regime, by Russia, how many of them have joined armed resistance, perhaps, in Ukraine. If we don't have figures, it is also understandable, since many of Crimean Tatars, as far as I know, cannot disclose their participation in the Ukrainian armed forces for the safety reasons for those families and friends who remain in Crimea. But what is there, Alim, that we can actually discuss, and how we can portray the resistance of Crimean Tatars and their situation basically these days?
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. Good evening, dear friends. Yeah, before I will give an answer to your question, I want to give broader context also on the topic of deportation as purposeful imperial policy of Russia for the Crimean Tatars. Yeah, because what important to say is that deportation resulted not only into deaths, but also in the erasure and of identity, as Stalin's regime effectively outlawed the Crimean Tatars ethnonym. Only the word Tatars was used in official documents so that the people would not be associated with the peninsula, but rather in connection with the concept of the single Tatar nation, with the Kazan Tatar, Russian Tatars, etc., etc., etc. Dozens of traditional crafts were also lost. Family heirlooms were confiscated, lost, or bartered for basic food in the first years of deportation. About religion, Elmira say a lot, and the Crimean Tatar language was not taught. And that's why, for example, the mission of my grandfathers, grandparents, was not only to return to Crimea, but also to preserve their identity. And today, when we have a full-scale war in Ukraine, one of the main issues is identity. And during 241 years, Crimean Tatars struggle for their own identity, and the colonialism of the peninsula is today the third attempt of Russian colonialism of peninsula. And here, colonialism, it's about appropriation or destruction. There are no third way. And when I talk about it, I talk in a few dimensions of colonialism. First, it's population replacement. During last 10 years, more than 70,000 Crimean inhabitants left Crimea. 50,000 of them are Crimean Tatars. But during this is 10 years, from 700,000 to 800,000 of new population came to Crimea from Russia. It's a settlement colonization. And the history of Crimea is also not the first attempt. I love to give a few figures. before the first annexation of Crimea, 95% of all of population Crimea were Crimean Tatars. Now it's dropped into 13, 15%. Second dimension, it's of course identity. And it's about Crimean Tatar language, that endangered language according to UNESCO. And today, one of the only 3% of Crimean students can learn Crimean Tatar language. But it's also about destroying tangible Crimean Tatar heritage, as a hand palace in Bakhchisarai, yeah, that destroyed under the guise of restoration. And third important dimension of colonization is a militarization of consciousness. Because today, Crimea, one of the main platforms for launching missiles to another territories of Ukraine by Russia. But when we talk about militarization of consciousness, it means that Russia glorify Russian army, glorify cult of war in a school through the launching so-called paramilitary organization as a UNARMY. And when we talk about resistance, of course, during the 10 years, we have in Crimea permanent resistance. And Miriam mentioned about Crimean solidarity. And Crimean solidarity is a institution, organization, initiative that founded after the temporary occupation. And one of the main goals is to support the families of political prisoners, but also to cover the courts against political prisoners and the situation in Crimea as a whole. That's why today 13, 15 Crimean political prisoners are still journalists, mostly from the Crimean Solidarity. Second, it's resistance. It's also about preserving identity. That's why during all of this period, we had new initiatives. For example, parent initiatives that organizing the language courses for their own children, or cultural initiatives, or media initiatives that cover the cultural, historical aspects. Because today, even Russia trying to steal from us the right of our memory, historical memory, to have this memory. And last but not least, when we talk about resistance, it's of course growing resistance after full-scale invasion. A few examples. Russian criminal courts launched near 800 cases of so-called how it will be
condemnation of the Russian military.
Russian army. And it's not, of course, about it. It's the cases when someone sing Ukraine songs, or with Ukraine flags, has some avatars in social media, or even teachers in schools just talk about this war and this and that it's a Russian aggression. But also, if we talk about Ukraine army and Crimean Tatars in Ukraine army, I'm also a volunteer, and I talk a lot with our warriors in front line from the different parts of front line, and a lot of Crimean Tatars in the ranks of Ukrainian army, but most of them are in hidden way because a lot of their relatives, parents, wives are still living in Crimea. And also we have two battalions named after Noman Chelibji Khan and also Crimean battalion in the ranks of Ukrainian army. Because I think we really understand that it's also our own struggle not only for future, but struggle for our existence as a people. Thank you.
Thank you, Alim. This is incredibly useful and incredibly eloquent and incredibly important for all of us to understand. I think that the resistance of Crimean Tatars is something that gives us in the mainland Ukraine hope and strength to persevere in our fight and to know that we must return Crimea to Ukraine and to the Crimean Tatar people to its rightful place in history. Before we proceed to open up this discussion to your questions, I would like to allow myself a shameless plug. 3 speakers of this panel are authors published in the London Ukrainian Review, which I have the absolute honor to edit. Emine, Rory, and Alim have contributed articles to the latest Crimean issue, dedicated actually to the Crimean Tatars and to the 80th anniversary of the deportation. So I encourage all of you to go and explore. And another thing which I hope you will allow me to mention, there are QR codes around this room which you can also explore and contribute if you can, however you can, to the resistance of Crimean Tatar people to the Russian aggression. So here we go. And now I hope that you are jumping on your seats and you have prepared your questions, which I'm very eager to hear. And the first question is already here, but I'll take a few. So please, with the gentleman.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for a really informative talk. And it goes without saying that we all hope that there's peace and prosperity in Ukraine and around the world generally. But I do want to start with a slightly controversial question. First of all, Amina spoke a lot about Sunni Muslims and the fact that this Islamic identity is inextricably linked with the Crimean nation. And Professor Finnan, who I know is from Columbia, graduate from Columbia, spoke a lot about the hope that Ukrainians in the after this war, Crimean Tatars, help shape Ukraine going forward. And I also heard about the Crimean Tatar soldiers in the front line at the military. But obviously, because the Crimeans generally come from a Sunni Muslim background, the dominant discourse from the Ukrainian government has been very pro-Israel. And some would argue that there's a genocide going there. And I wondered, Professor Friedman and everyone else's view, so far as keeping the community together in Ukraine, whether this, some would argue, disconnect between what the government is saying and what is actually happening globally can have an impact on the interrelations and interconnections between the Crimean Tatars in Ukraine and Ukrainian people generally. Having said that, I'm also aware that a lot of Ukrainian scholars have written a joint letter separating themselves from the government line. But I'm just interested in what your view is about that, bearing in mind that a lot of Crimeans come from the Sunni Muslim background.
Thank you. We'll collect more questions. Yes, please.
Well, like the previous, congratulations for the meeting. You know, we're marking the 80th anniversary at a time of a watershed in world politics marked by Putin's invasion of Ukraine and Hamas's 7th of October pogrom in Israel. And I'd like Rory Finn and perhaps others to comment on how Stalin's deportation, aggression, and whatever you want to call it, against the Tatars was part of his murderous reversal of Lenin's course on the national question, closely intertwined with Stalin's revival of anti-Semitism against Lenin's 2-decade-long fight against Jew hatred and pogroms in Russia.
Thank you. I think we can kind of combine these two questions and ask Rory in the first place to speak about the Islamic and the Jewish side and the contradictions between the two and how it fits into the global political landscape. Not a very easy question to handle, Rory, but I have faith in you.
Thanks, Sasha. That's enough to inspire me to try. First of all, thank you for your questions. When I was speaking about the Crimean Tatars and the shaping of Ukraine's civic identity, what I meant as well is that this has been going on for quite a long time. And it's important, I think, under the circumstances, given, as you say, the world we live in now, where we're doom scrolling, every day there's a new headline that horrifies us. I think we are all burdened by knowledge that we have difficulty processing. And I think in light of that, I am very sensitive to conflating a lot of very complicated and sensitive issues here. And I want to try to, if it's possible, focus to the extent we can here on the Crimean Tatar experience. However, I do want to speak and not ignore the horrors in Gaza, and at the same time, the horror of 7th of October, and to maybe caution us to not get pulled into very intractable, very difficult conversations. And I also want to thank Sasha for the London Ukrainian Review, which is asking us in the context of Ukrainian studies and the study and understanding of Ukraine to think more closely about these issues related to Islam, the Crimean Tatars, the Ukrainian project as a civic national one, not an ethnic one. It's often read as ethnic here in Great Britain, and that's been a perennial problem. But I'm very grateful for the questions and for the points here about the Middle East. And that's not me evading anything. It's an attempt to be present as best we can to these specific experiences. And also to mention that religion is a huge component of this. And Elmira mentioned that there's a real tight connection between the Islamic tradition, but also the the Crimean Tatar national movement is marked by a really remarkable secularism as well. So as many of you may know, the Crimean Tatar national movement in the 19th century, early 20th, was probably the most progressive proponent of a new political Islam. Sleepy Bakhchisarai was a place that published works that advanced education, the cause of women, and really were invested in the idea of bringing a Western perspective, as it were, to Islam. And so there's a really interesting connection and intersection there between the secularism and Islam too that we shouldn't forget. And I don't want to pull them apart. So that's my way of answering the question, and I appreciate you bringing it up.
Thank you. More questions, please, from the audience. While you're thinking about your next question, I would like to point out another parallel that Rory draws in his article between the Kurultai of the Crimean Tatar people and the Ukrainian inspiration of this project. So again, I encourage you to go and explore after our meeting the London Ukrainian Review. Valeria.
Thank you so much for everything that you told us today, and for everyone who before maybe didn't know as much about the Crimean Tatars. But I wanted to ask you about Russia's policy specifically of imprisoning political activists, political dissent, and Russia has obviously been doing that for a very long time during the Soviet Union, but also since 2014. And the numbers show, of course, that a large majority of the people that Russia has imprisoned have been Crimean Tatars. So I was just wondering if you could share perhaps any people or cases that we should remember about and that we should kind of keep pushing for the world to not forget.
Thank you. Very good question. Olesa.
I am going to ask you all to share or to guide us, maybe to give us some kind of road signs towards avenues where we can learn about Crimean Tatar Crimea through culture, and not do so only once a year on the very sad anniversary. It pains me that Ukrainian culture, rich literature is being discovered largely because it has been erased by Russia. So yeah, I'd encourage you all to share something where we can go and read, given that we can't visit Crimea yet, not until it comes back firmly within Ukrainian borders. What can we do?
Thank you. Let's start with the human rights issue, with its abuse in Crimea, and here I would probably pose this question for Alim, and then whoever wants to contribute. Could you please share with us some cases that for you are illustrative of what Russia's occupation regime is doing to the Crimean Tatar people in Crimea?
Yes, thank you, colleagues. Of course, if we talk about human rights violations in Crimea during these 10 years, human rights defenders fixed more than 5,000 cases of human rights violations, and it's really different types of violations, from the freedom of speech to the violations against the nationality. But before I would ask about give an answer to this question. I want also to add about this Crimean Tatars and our Muslim religious identity. What's important to understood, Russian authorities are also using Crimean Tatar religious identity, something that has always played an important role for us, against us by fabricating the image of Muslim terrorists and extremists. These two articles uses in the prosecutors through the many Crimean Tatar political prisoners, and we are Sunni Muslims, and but Russia tried to build this image of terrorists and extremists without the context. Nonviolent resistance, both in Soviet times and during the temporary occupation, is a fundamental element of the struggle for our land. And when we talk about the situation with the human rights in Crimea, we should talk about a few cases. First case is a case of my friend, permanent Crimean Tatar leader, Nariman Jilal. He's a journalist and first deputy head of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people, and the loudest voice of all of free inhabitants of Crimea. On September 2021, Russian security officials detained Nariman and two Akhtemov cousins over the so-called explosion near a gas pipeline. Since his detention, Nariman was handcuffed and had a bag over his head for almost 24 hours. Akhtemov cousins confessed under the torture. And today we are consider an arrest of Nariman Jalal and Akhtem of Cousins as a revenge for the Crimean platform. Nariman was a speaker of this summit. And today Russia arrested Nariman and sentenced him to 17 years in prison. Such, we have a lot of dozens such cases of human rights violations in Crimea. But as I said, on the ground of all of these violations, we have this colonization that trying to change Crimean Tatars into Russian citizens.
Thank you, Alim, and I will now turn to Emine with the same question.
I just wanted to add, probably from my own experience. In 2016, I worked with a writer, journalist, Lily Hyde, British journalist actually, and we tried to do like multiple stories about persecution of Crimean Tatars in Crimea and about the court cases. And it's such a difficult subject from every point you look and perspective. On one hand, you have a lot of people who suffered because they are Crimean Tatars. And there are cases not just like based on terrorism, extremism, and separatism charges. There are like a lot of discrimination when Crimean Tatar businesses were shut, where pretty much businesses were taken. There were court cases. I have one relative with a court case like that. And it's like people do believe that those cases are, the ground of these cases is because people are Crimean Tatars. And all of these Crimean Tatar initiatives in Crimea, they were also like supported by Crimean Tatar businesses in Crimea. And so you have a case when you go and you find these cases, or you find the families, and they would not talk to you because you're a journalist, because they live in Crimea, and they would get persecuted more, and they would have more consequences. If they have a fine, or like 1 year or 2 years, or like probation. Otherwise, if they would talk out, they're afraid that they would actually have like imprisonment. And that is like all the different kind of cases, economic, non-economic, and all kind of like administrative cases. And then you have families who would talk, and usually those families who would talk is the people who would get, or already getting 20 to 25 years of imprisonment, or the ones of family members who already have been quite heavily tortured by FSB, or like very concrete cases when you know that is like there is no way out. And so those families who were searched, and they like pretty much do not have other choice than to speak. They speak to the Western media as they speak to Ukrainian media, because they kind of feel that they don't have anything more to lose. And so all these cases which we have, like, except for several cases which like Western world considered straight political cases as a political prisoners, you have most of the cases which go Hizb ut-Tahrir cases of like a Muslim, kind of like a subgroup. And so they all go with terrorism charges, but it's not only that, it's like, it's actually Russia play theater in the court, and they make these demonstrative court cases. And if, especially before 2022, when you try to write an article about it, as a journalist, you cannot avoid writing, this is a person, and Russia is charging it with terrorism or extremism. And this law on extremism and terrorism is very similar to Western Europe or American laws. And the moment you write that, there is no story. It's killed story in the media, and you cannot communicate it. Even before 2022, let's say, we were talking about Memorial in Russia, which would do political cases. Even them, they would not, or Sava was like, Sava, I think the organization, even them, they would not list these people as political prisoners, even though they are clearly political prisoners, and they were persecuted on ethnic basis and things like that. So it's like, and I think like it's still the same case right now. And since full-scale invasion, it became even harder to communicate. I mean, it's like 25 years of imprisonment compared maybe. I mean, what's going on in Ukraine is so horrendous since full-scale invasion. It's the cases like and we almost do not get any information from occupied territories, including Crimea. And the risks of talking out is even higher. And it's not just, I mean, I talked to my parents. If Elmira mentions that like this social gathering in Crimea used to be like a place to shape a collective memory and talk about deportation or talk about what's happening around, these days, people do not talk even this social gathering because no one knows who is listening and who would it get reported. And when I say reported, it's like it's a Soviet type reporting when you say something to your client and then next day the tax office comes to you. And this is like cases with my relatives. And it's just horrendous. So it's almost impossible to get any proper information unless you talk to very close relatives.
Thank you. I would like to pose the same question for Elmira, and unless you would like to proceed and discuss the topic raised by Olesa, which is Crimean Tatar culture and how we can explore it, and just charting the map for us of how we can engage meaningfully with the culture of Crimea's indigenous people.
Okay, I'll try, Sasha. You know, being an academic, it's very difficult to get out of academic shoes, so I will talk from academic perspective. Well, we're talking about 10 years of life in occupation. So it's a huge period of time, and many things are changing in Crimea. So Crimean Tatars 10 years ago and now, completely different people. No, really different people. But what scares me is that we don't really know what's going on there. Thanks to human rights activists, we know about persecutions, we know about repressions, but we don't know what's going on with identity, with values, with intragroup dynamics. So this is, I think, for me as a researcher, this is the most troubling thing, because like when the occupation happens, we have to deal with people who lived for 10 years under the occupation, and whose perceptions and mindset was shaped by Russian imperial discourse, and we don't have an idea, what's going on. So, going to your question about culture, I can recommend a wonderful piece, a wonderful article written by Maria Shenkarenko. She's the one who managed to do a fieldwork in Crimea, and she actually explored how culture was used for this hidden resistance to occupying forces. I think it's a fascinating case study, like how she tried to prove that, even through culture, through seemingly very obedient behavior, you can resist, you can do something to preserve your identity, to show that, to go out of that marginalized place which Russian authorities give Crimean Tatars. So the article is Compliant Subjects. It was published in 22. It's, I think, not problematic to find it. So I really recommend it. It's a fascinating piece of. And also, I want to repeat my recommendation about Haytarma movie, because every time I show it to, for example, students, the reaction is amazing. It's like, you're opening a new world to people who haven't had anything about Crimean Tatars, who haven't even imagined what could happen to a particular people at that period of time. So these are my recommendations.
Wonderful, thank you. And just to mention that, sorry, Alim, just forgive me for 1 second. I'll mention that Masha Shenkarenko wrote another article for the London Ukrainian Review. So please go and explore this fantastic issue. I'm just so honored with all these fantastic authors, where she actually writes about the indigeneity of Crimean Tatar people as the rightful claim for the peninsula. Alim, I'm turning to you now.
Yeah, I want to continue of recommendation what you can read, listen, and hear. First of all, we will talk about books in English. I will recommend, of course, the book of a good friend of mine, Rory Finnan, Blood of Others. Secondly, I'll recommend also academic online course about history and culture of Crimea and the Crimean Tatars that we launched as a Ukrainian institute in a Udemy platform. The name, of course, Crimea, History and People. Third, of course, I recommend to listen the new album of prominent Ukrainian singer Jamala with Crimean Tatar origin. The name Kerem. Kerem is a really, is a soil of Crimea and its indigenous inhabitants. And last but not least, I also recommend VR project that organized by Ukrainer, and also we supported this project named VR Crimea. The stories of four famous Ukrainians, Oleg Sentsov, Jamala, Mustafa Jamilov, and Artem Sitablaev, and stories for their families and their villages and native cities in Crimea.
Thank you.
And
of course.
Okay. I would recommend YouTube channel called Crimean Tatars. It's Karadeniz production based in Crimea these days. And it was a lot of them worked for TV channel ATR before, and they continue to work, and they do a lot of covering culture and history.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Of course.
Almost all of the selections that I was about to raise have been mentioned, and I just wanted to also say, in addition to Khaytarma, which is about the experience of Ahmet Khan Sultan, a hero of the Soviet Union, pilot who brought down so many different Nazi aircraft, and his experience of seeing his own people deported from the Crimea despite his service to the Red Army, a very common refrain. There's also, of course, the film by our friend Nariman Aliyev called Homeward, Evge Dodomo. And I believe it's available either on BBC iPlayer or Netflix, but it's streamable. So for those of you who can see that, it's highly recommended. And also to point out a translation that's recently been supported by the Ukrainian Institute London by a wonderful translator named Daisy Gibbons. It's a story by Lesya Ukrainka, originally called Nad Morem, or At the Seaside. It's about the deep colonial relationship between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. It's witnessed by a female protagonist, a brilliant story, very important to see. And then for those Ukrainians here who haven't got their hands on the book Zapera Kopom Ye Zemlya by Anastasia Levkova, it's a brilliant book that amazingly really unleashes and brings to the fore the rich history of Crimea amongst different groups. Those are the works that I wanted to raise as well.
Fantastic, and I'm seconding all the topics raised here and highly recommending all these important pieces. And before we move on, I have probably one last question from myself, if you don't mind me abusing this place as a moderator. I'm thinking about demilitarization and deoccupation of Crimea, which has been such a contentious issue here in the West for a very long time, because people just could not imagine how Ukraine could return Crimea and dig it out from the Russian occupation. Today, I believe that the situation has changed, and since Crimea has been used as a launch pad for all those missile strikes against Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, we understand that peace in Ukraine and on the continent is impossible without the deoccupation of Crimea. So I just wanted to ask all our speakers, how do they see this situation moving forward? How do they see this from a diplomatic perhaps perspective? Has it been better understood recently that the deoccupation of Crimea is an essential component of our movement towards peace? Whoever wants to begin. Rory?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate you drawing attention to Crimea, and it's important, I think all of us understand that the full-scale invasion in 2002 likely would have not begun had it not been for the annexation operation of 2014. The annexation operation of 2014 likely would not have taken place were it not for the deportation of the Crimean Tatars in 1944. We can go back in history and we can see the legacy and implications of these events. Crimea is really at the center of what has engulfed Europe in great crisis and instability. And it's important for us to keep our eye on what's happening in Crimea, even when journalists, analysts, politicians keep pulling our attention elsewhere. Focusing on Crimea is very important. And as you say, Sasha, we have to also begin to rationalize how a deoccupation of Crimea is possible. For some reason, we are still acquiescing to the idea of Russia having some sort of special hold on Crimea, or that there are real red lines with respect to Crimea. What we really need to understand is how deeply historical the relationship between mainland Ukraine and the peninsula of Crimea is, how that connection and relationship is deeply important geostrategically and geopolitically, and to understand how Ukraine can indeed deoccupy, how it is right now actively demilitarizing and deoccupying the Crimean Peninsula. As you said, years ago, no one would have imagined a deoccupation of Crimea by military force, but it's taking place and it's real. So if we can focus on this in this room, encourage all of our colleagues and friends to do the same, I think our intellectual energy being brought to this question will pay off over the long run.
Yes, thank you. Elmira and Alim.
I just that I know that in Ukraine, mainland Ukraine, there is already work going on so-called cognitive deoccupation of Crimea. There is a team of experts who are working on various strategies and methods and techniques how to work with the population of Crimea. And it shows the importance that and recognition of the difficult path which ahead, after the military occupation. So I think this is the sphere where people who can do must invest their time and resources to the best of our knowledge to contribute to the process. Because this is important. Like people are important, not only territory.
Yeah, first of all, people, and it's absolute value should be absolute value for all of us. As for state, Ukrainian state, and also for the civil society. And the future of Crimean Tatars can only be in a democratic Ukraine, as I mentioned before. And for Crimean Tatars, it's also important for restoration of our collective rights. And we're talking a lot, and now we have started this discussion about Crimean Tatar national autonomy in Ukraine, what it means for all of us. And as for me, it's an opportunity for Crimean Tatars take the responsibility for the Crimea. Yeah, because after when we returned to Crimea after the 1989, we returned as a people who don't accepted by population who live after the deportation, who came to Crimea after the deportation, and who lived in our houses. And that's why it's a crucial question for our existence.
Emine?
I just want to say that, like, I want to agree with you and probably everyone else that we cannot talk about really peace in Europe without complete decolonization of Ukraine and territorial integrity of whole Ukraine as it was before 2014, including Crimea. And I just also want to say, of course, it all depends on the military course and how the war moving forward, Russian-Ukrainian war, Russo-Ukrainian war, and it all depends on also on the support, on the position of allies like Europe and the US and all of the other countries, and how we manage it. But of course, like when I think about the occupation of Crimea, I very often think about the occupation of the minds of Crimeans who live there, because I think it's for Ukrainians and for other people, like it probably would have to accept that this population who participated part of it on the other side of the war needs to be reintegrated into society, including with different views, different memory about this war as well, a different identity. But at the same time, I feel quite hopeful, because in 2014, like observing and seeing annexation unfolding in front of my own eyes, I grew up in Crimea, and I was observing a lot of friends and relatives, and I want to say, it's like I actually moved back to Crimea in January 2014, and within 2 months, somehow there were mass hysteria, everyone's minds changed. So like, if that was possible to happen in 2014, it's probably possible to happen after the occupation of Crimea again. So I think most of the people are actually quite swingy, I would say, in their political views.
Thank you. I like this sensical and hopeful view of the future, which certainly will be the Crimean Tatar autonomy within Ukraine. Crimea will be for the Crimean Tatars, and Crimea will be Ukrainian, and it will be free. And for all of us, I would like just to bear in mind the lesson of the Crimean Tatar resistance. If they can resist after the deportation, after all the crimes that have been done to these people, and now and today, under the repressions of Russia's occupational regime, we here in the freedom of the West should do whatever is there that we can do to help return Crimea to Ukraine and deoccupy it mentally and militarily. Here it just remains to be said that we must not ever again mark the anniversary of the Crimean Tatar deportation while Crimea is unfree. The next one should be marked by us when Crimea is already free and returned to Ukraine. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Inshallah, indeed. Thank you for your attention. Just to mention that Ukrainian Institute London is a charity, and we rely on your support to continue doing our work. So please like, share, follow, subscribe, and comment. Come to our events, stay in touch on social media, and please seek those QR codes dispersed in this room. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.